Anj. And I will live.
Okay, so, what's the deal with the whole recurring founding nations thing? That wasn't part of any of the stories I listed off before. Well, that is because it is part of the final series that makes up the continuity of the AD dimension. Cross-Ange, Rondo of Angels and Dragons. And just by saying its name, I know a majority of people watching this video have either no idea what I'm talking about, or just started spitting fire.
Cross-Ange,
Yeah, I've heard it both ways.
was a Sunrise anime released in 2014 and 2015, and it didn't get much spotlight because of Sunrise's bigger projects those years, which entirely overshadowed it during its airing, such as both Gundam Build Fighters and Build Fighters Tri, Gundam Reconquista in G, which Cross-Range actually did better than it, and most prominently, Gundam Iron-Blooded Orphans.
Well, that and it's written more for late teens to adults versus Sunrise's preference to aiming for general audience appeal. Likewise, its import made it practically invisible, as such was done by Sentai Filmworks, which, while they have a very good library of content, is kind of terrible in marketing it because they do not have the money to do so. Thus, the series went under most people's radar. Though, I have a theory on why this game decided to include the series as they have.
Cross-Ange's director and creative producer, meaning he was actively working with writer Tatsuo Higuchi in development of the story, was Mitsuo Fukada, a long-standing Sunrise staff member most known for the Gundam Seed series, that were initially written by his lifelong friend and eventually 2008 wife, Chiaki Morisawa, who became ill after the completion of Gundam Seed. While she wrote the general narrative outline for Gundam Seed Destiny when a sequel was requested, she was too sick from the treatments for her illness to write any of the episodes for it herself, which then in turn fell to the people who screwed up pretty badly in their execution of and divergence from her outlines. Had Sunrise agreed to delay Seed Destiny until after her treatment was completed and she recovered, well, things would have turned out a lot different.
While some people blame Morisawa herself for being difficult in regards to story progression, primarily because of disagreements with Sunrise over Seed getting shortchanged, which required the use of recap episodes, flashbacks, and stock footage recycling as they didn't have what they need to animate everything the way it should have been, thus why the Seed Remaster project was eventually needed a decade later. Well, Sunrise poured wasted time and effort into Gundam Evolve and the awful MS Igloo, and she didn't want that to happen again. Thus, a lot of what made Seed Destiny disliked has a round table of causes and people responsible for it, so it is difficult to find one factor that messed it all up outside of Morisawa's sickness setting off the situation in the first place, which was completely beyond her control, and no sane person should fault her for that. But what does not help matters on getting the facts straight about this is most places in America that report on anime tend to mess up the timing of Morisawa's illness, so blame continues to fall on solely her unfairly, claiming she got sick after Destiny or towards the end of Destiny's production instead of before it. They confuse when they first announced she was sick with when she first fell ill and had to step back, which was while Destiny was in development. And before someone in the comments replies with evidence to the contrary, well, I will freely admit there is a lot of misinformation about the Seed series out there, but I take the position I do from both knowledge of the timing of Morisawa's illness that has been corroborated, and the fact that she is not credited as the primary writer of any episode of Seed Destiny. There are other people credited as actually writing them, meaning other people took what was supplied and ran with it, which usually doesn't happen unless something is up with the main writer in a Japanese series. But regardless, Morisawa's illness requiring others take over writing duties is the primary reason for why Gundam Seed Destiny's story became a train wreck. As without a proper guiding hand overseeing everything, there was a complete loss of consistency, both internally and with the previous content. And while purely from a narrative and thematic perspective the Seed series should be considered good shows, the problem came from the execution by the show's actual scriptwriters, and people just missing details included within them that attempted to justify their stories or direction. And the problems in reception discourse caused by this with Destiny negatively impacted the standing and reputation of the original Seed as well. Like, I rewatched Seed with my roommates when Nozomi released the remaster on Blu-ray in 2020, and I liked it more than I did when it originally aired. And once again found it not deserving of the hate on people have for it in isolation. Though, I still prefer the original Bandai dub, because at least there, they got the pronunciation of names and terminology right, instead of the remaster dub constantly screwing them up. Why does this keep happening with anime that gets redubs where the new dub team doesn't check how words are supposed to be said anyways? And this was made worse with Destiny, because they handed that series over to several writers that, by the evidence of their existing body of work, had no idea how to develop any of the provided narrative arc and the characters involved, nor understood how to use the characters they were given, and didn't grasp how to successfully present the execution of that story. This also explained why much of the returning Seed cast spent a fair chunk of the series completely out of character with the actions they take until far too late, and the intended world direction of the series not understood by a large portion of the audience. They didn't grasp a way to pull it off that most people would get unless they wanted to force feed it to them, which in and of itself would defeat the purpose. Like, a lot of Destiny and the zeitgeist for bashing it ends up like that. There are reasons for why things happen, it's just the specific writers for the episodes refuse to present it. So we only get that in retrospect after the action themselves have lost the goodwill of the audience, as they were unwilling to wait for it to actually be elaborated on by other writers on the crew. Thus, making Seed Destiny a series that, while it is admittedly better on the rewatch after you know where the hell it's going, is not rated highly. But because the audience, especially the Western audience for the show, were willing to wait for the actual motives to be made clear, well, there's a reason there's a lot of misinformation about the Seed series. Instead of trying to grasp an actual answer from what's supplied in the show or from its themes, they intentionally did not pay attention and decided to start making shit up and bash its content using an interpretation not present in the series itself. Like, to use an example of how bad the misinformation about what screwed up Destiny gets, there's this long-standing claim that the reason the Seed originating characters were screwed over was because Naomi Shindo, the actress for the character Kigali Yula Atha, had an affair with director Fukuda, and Morisawa took vengeance for it through screwing over the legacy characters. But it's a long discredited claim, backed up by Shindo still getting work, as normally that kind of thing destroys their careers. And doesn't make sense when you're likewise aware that Morisawa and Fukuda didn't become romantically involved until long after Destiny ended. Morisawa, due to her illness, didn't have the power to influence what happened to Kigali, and the character portrayal problems are far easier to explain via Occam's razor, of it being the result of writers not familiar with the characters messing up their presented portrayal because they weren't consistent between the contents. That happens all the time across entertainment, and I point out when that happens constantly in the series I review. What further discredits this rumor to me is, in every source iteration I've ever seen that people reference, their source claims Chiaki Morisawa was a man, and Shindo had a lesbian affair with Morisawa's wife, on top of them claiming Shindo was dating Fukuda, as opposed to Morisawa being the other woman in the act of infidelity. Which, when that is pointed out, they then spike it to Fukuda cheating on her, which, again, makes this entire claim extremely suspect. Likewise not helped that this is frequently confused with the discredited claim that Yoshiki Tomino sexually harassed actress Yo Inoue, who played Sayla Mast in the original Gundam series. And that being some stupid people's explanation for why Sayla kept not reappearing in the sequel content to the original Gundam series. And to be clear, as I do not want to deliberately spread misinformation, that is also a long discredited, unsubstantiated rumor that has no basis in fact. And yet with how Tomino treats women in his stories, it actually felt more believable for a time than the Fukuda Morisawa Shindo rumor. But again, the rumor about Tomino is downplayed whilst people still maliciously spread the other, because they want to slander Fukuda, Morisawa, and Shindo, even though they're not responsible, and those doing so have deliberately chosen not to blame who is, and thus let the actual offenders get away with it, and to ruining other content. Hell, you wanna know who the worst offender towards the character inconsistencies, who also made a mess of Destiny's protagonist Shin Asuka's arc is? That writer is Hiroyuki Yoshino, who is an infamous bad writer known for his track record of rushing stories to the detriment of character and not explaining in his scripts why what happens in them occur, in the same manner people were complaining about with Seed Destiny. It is consistent across the board with him throughout his career, but it's just not recognized because, of course, no one thinks to track patterns of behavior with the writers behind such. And I could specifically cite a pattern of him screwing over women who have characteristics similar to Kigali's.
And while it might not have been intended by the game's makers at the time this game was in development, this does tie thematically into why Cross Ange's story is part of the AD dimension, as in February of 2016, Chiaki Morisawa passed away, dying from an aortic dissection which originated from her prior illness, permanently cutting off more Gundam Seed content from being produced with its original creator involved beyond Tomohiro Chiba's Gundam Seed Astray side stories, which are still running to this day.
Oh, and yes, since this video keeps syncing up with timely news that relates to it, I've had to revise this script a lot. I do know about the Gundam Seed 20th anniversary event, Project Ignited. As I adore the mecha designs of the Seed series, I immediately put the Master Grade Gundam Eclipse on pre-order. I expect the Gundam Eclipse manga to be good, as the rest of Seed's manga side stories have been good, and I am very happy to know that the Gundam Seed movie that's coming will be based on the unpublished final script of Chiaki Morisawa, which has been sitting in a file cabinet at Sunrise for over a decade. And likewise, I am happy that Mitsuo Fukada is in charge of all these projects and overseeing the final script revision for that movie. First, it allows him to preserve the legacy of his late wife's work now that he is in a position at Sunrise that will allow him to prevent it from being screwed over by Yoshiki Tomino or anyone else at the company, as happened previously, since the Cosmic Era is rated as the second most popular Gundam timeline, despite Kira Yamato rates as the fourth most popular character in the franchise, behind Amuro Ray, Char Aznable, and Mikazuki Argus. And second, because Fukada himself is a good and influential director. As beyond Seed, Fukada is known for a lot of important works, such as the animation direction on the Brave series. Just one example of how influential a reference the guy is. Do you all know of the Brave perspective pose? The one with someone holding a weapon out in front of them at such an angle that the tip of the tool seems far more massive in comparison to the individual holding it? The one often miscredited as the Obari pose? You guys should. Next to the Akira bike slide, it's considered one of the most homaged and loved bits of animation the world over. And it's only, 30 years old. And Mitsuo Fukada is the one who actually created it. Yeah, that specific pose actually originated from him when he worked on the animation for the series Brave X Kaiser. If you've heard the pose credited to animator Masami Obari, however, well, that's actually not wrong either, as Obari was actually Fukada's inspiration in having the wielder snapping down their sword from above them into the pose, which is part of why it is so iconic. And Fukada eventually gave Obari credit for the art and animation style Fukada was emulating with that pose, even though Obari took no part in animating it, and Fukada is 100% the one who came up with it. Fukada is actually really modest like that, as well a lot of his animation and art direction is highly innovative and influential in mecha genre from the 90s onwards with how things are depicted. He always prefers to pass the credit for his artistic, creative, and directorial decisions onto his own influences and inspirations, which he emulated and remixed as part of his own identity, which others then emulated and ran with themselves. It is a big reason to why Seed is seen as such a big, new influence series for tales and shows past it. To the point newer Universal Century projects like Gundam Unicorn took heavy inspiration from the Seed series to back adapt its elements. And with how the remixes of older concepts within it shed light on new merits and new ways to present stories completely distinct from the content of the prior 30 years, while still paying homage to older material.
So while it is not the sole reason why Cross Age is here as it is in this game, it crossing over with Seed as a merger of the Fukada-directed shows is nonetheless acting as a final tribute in honor of his wife's work for Sunrise, and a properly integrated talent that they'd wanted to have as part of Seed, but circumstances kept preventing. Cross Ange's main protagonist is Princess Angelise Ikaruga Mitsurugi, a character voiced by actress and singer Nana Mizuki. Morosawa and Fukuda originally wanted to include her in Seed as the recurring character of Shiho Hosenka Hanenfuss, but was unable at the time. However, Shiho is canon to the Gun & Seed timeline, with her actually making it unvoiced into Destiny in several scenes, and the character is then seen in the final moments of that series as the story closes out.
Anj, in turn, I have heard, though if that's not true, I apologize up front for making the mistake, was originally thought of as a reimagined version of Shiho's character, with Nana Mizuki being the first vocal talent thought of to voice her because of the missed chances a decade before, and also to help Mizuki in her efforts at the time to break out of the typecasting she'd suffered thanks to her voicing shy wallflower characters for much of her then career, and get her something more like an aggressive and boisterous firebrand, which is more in her natural range, which admittedly she had already been moving into doing on her own with the likes of Tsubasa Kazunari in Symphogear. And I talked more about the backstory of Anj here, because the actual series has its plot play out as some of the major content of the game, and I will be discussing it throughout the game review as a result.
Which starts out with Angelise being exposed to her horror as a Norma, a person that cannot use the power of mana, a material generation and information transference technology that is indistinguishable from actual magic, in a society where everyone can use mana, with a Norma's mere presence being able to shatter mana constructs. Norma are resultantly viewed as non-human beings for it in this society. Her parents, the rulers of the Holy Mitsurugi Empire, having hidden this fact about her from birth. Angelise's personal maid Momoko performing all the feats of magic through her life to help cover for her, and upon a ceremony on her 16th birthday that would have led to her beginning to serve her people, she had this black secret of her family exposed by her elder brother Giulio, a man hungry for power and control of the empire that their parents had decided would make for an awful ruler, and whose actions led to both of their parents' deaths. Their mother dying attempting to save Angelise, and then her father being executed for breaking the founding nation's laws about the treatment and retention of Norma within their borders, with even Angelise's crippled sister Sophia turning her back on her.
That law, by the way, makes no sense. At least if it weren't for the propaganda spread about Norma that depict them as vile, amoral, aberrant monsters that devour the mana of their victims to pleasure themselves. And other reasons atop of that, which makes the existence of the laws self-fulfilling propaganda. Basically, the laws of persecution the Norma experience is all one massive implanted falsehood and group-thought racism enforced because none of them know any better. They're indoctrinated from birth to think of Norma as things, not people. Operations in their perceived order of everything. Something that Angelise is guilty of as well. And spoilers for later in the series story, some thing has enslaved them into thinking like that.
As the Norma after their discovery are sent to the island of Arsenal, where the forces of Arsenal, an all-women strike force as the genes that cause the normal state make it so only women are victims to it, are conscripted until their deaths to fight against literal dragons that regularly attempt to invade the founding nations. Or so it seems. The grand majority of members of Arsenal have varying psychological issues brought from the trauma of being thrown out and abandoned by their respective families and friends and forced into war, unintentionally buying into the propaganda about how Norma are amoral savages, and Angelise is no different. With her first being imprisoned, then outwardly being antagonistic in her disbelief of what she's been reduced to. Unwilling to accept the truth of the lie she's unknowingly lived all her life, and not a single member of Arsenal she's confronted with showing her the empathy she needs to break down and get over her hurdle. Instead, insulted that the princess managed to cheat this fate for so long and refuses to face the facts before her.
Suffice it to say, most of the cast of Cross-Ange, I really don't know which of the two I should be using, can be best described as hostile Valkyrie bitches, to borrow a descriptive term coined by Bennett the Sage, which once again makes the Symphogear illusion Nana Mizuki brings in hilarious, considering that show had its production staff clarify that the series' tagline read as Swan Song of the Valkyries. I don't know, blame my roommate Alexis for really getting me into that series. Regardless, the hostility the characters present is pretty severe in the early side of the show, to the point that it turned off a lot of people to it. Most of the discourse around the series always centers itself upon the first several episodes' presentation of events as, well, it can be pretty disturbing and graphic, with its simultaneous metaphorical and literal attempts to break the main character. But unlike other content I've savaged in the past for just including such to be dark and edgy and sexual and lewd for no other reason than to have that exist, well, there actually is a point to having Anj go through it.
And worse, not long after being abandoned here, she's immediately drafted into combat action, against their own regulations in an attempt to break her in, without the training to prepare her for what she faces. And because she is, and has not been allowed to bridge a real connection with those around her that she was made to believe were subhuman and her fellow Norma being awful to her in turn, when faced with the reality of death, she panics, and becomes responsible for the deaths of her unit's captain and 2 fellow trainees. Ironically, the 2 that died, being individuals that did try to reach out to her, were in the minority in trying to show her empathy, and that she rejected as she wanted to lie to herself. And despite early deployment being against Arsenal's own regulations for this specific reason,
it's later revealed this was part of Anj's elder brother Julio's own attempt to solidify his power by getting his sister killed off. And also Jill wanting in her own way to use Anj as a weapon for reasons I'll get into later.
Everyone else at Arsenal blames Angelise for the others' deaths because when faced with death, she ran away and left them to die. Something unthinkable to the rest of Arsenal. And to be clear, once she's confronted with that reality, the reality of those who died were no different from her or anyone, Angelise does blame herself as well. People died because she was weak and wanted to believe her parents lied.
The Norma can only exist in this world as dragon-slaying machines.
Besides, you're the princess. You should be honored to risk your life to keep their world safe.
Their world?
Humans take their peace for granted. They don't have a clue that the Norma are dying to make it happen.
There is no reason for you to imprison me in this hellish place. This isn't fair at all.
Then what the hell does that make you? You can't use mana either. You deserted in the face of the enemy and got your underage allies killed. What do you call that?
And now she's all alone in this world because she tried to reject the enforced truth of the world, with nothing left but the life her parents died to save. A life considered worthless to the world she came from, the heaven that was her family's making, but one she has been cast down from, into her own personal hell, where she is viewed as just as worthless as the dirt around her. Into a world that treats her as dead from birth, a shambling corpse of a weapon, to fill a seat until the next weapon is brought in. And she in turn fills the next grave. No, you know what? Screw that! If the world believes Angelise Ikaruga Misarugi's life is worthless, then she'll abandon it, taking with her only her mother's song and ring as a reminder of where she came from, as a tribute to the woman who sought to save her own life. All that shall be left instead is Anj, the male rider of the ancient paramale Vilkis.
I do not want to die. I do not want to die. You will die!
With this resolve, Anj quickly proves to be a natural in the battlefield with her ferocity, but her prior actions and her own selfish wish for survival continues to not endear her to her fellow male riders. Though at the very least, the rest of the cast is a bit more open to empathizing with her plight of shoving a civilian out of nowhere into the battlefield, as that always results in casualties in a realistic universe.
And since it's going to be asked, yeah, I ended up liking Cross Anj. Cross Ange. Again, I don't know whether it's supposed to be pronounced as if it's the character's name or Angel without the L. Though I understand why others would not like this show. A lot of people really hate it. And it does have its own share of issues in regards to its content that easing into them with more established characters, as was done here in V, is not a bad idea, as it had reception issues tied to how it has a lot of fan service because most of its cast are women, and it does not address sexuality or interpersonal relationships the best either.
Hey, that felt good.
Should probably catch her.
Combined with the aforementioned overtones of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse in the first few episodes, and some later ones where a certain manipulative, narcissistic, sycophantic monster enters the series, yeah, I can get why some skip the larger series that work to explain why it had to be that way, and I can't blame them. I've done that with some shows myself, after only needing to see the first episode of it. The difference in my case, when that happens, is I can usually tell the full context of what the series is going to do from that episode due to my exposure to so many different stories that I can pick up on common tells of conduct. It's gotten to the point that I can predict the plots of entire shows if I am familiar with the idiosyncrasies of its staff, especially when their normal content is complete shit that they just repeat the failings of ad nauseum. However, having seen this series, I am of the opinion that the larger narrative arc of it would not have succeeded had they dialed it back and toned it down, as, hell, much like the Seed series, people missed the point as it was.
Cross Ange's larger story and theme is about persevering through adversity, by refusing to be bent or broken by having everything you ever knew and loved taken from you, every privilege revoked, every right you thought you were ensured stripped away, reduced to a slave and forced to fight for a life you'll just lose in the end, and taking that damn fate using the tools of a slave to strangle and spit in the literal face of God that made these rules to rise beyond it, and free herself from this broken world. It is the story of an abuse victim overcoming the trauma of what was done to her and moving beyond it.
On the oath you took.
Your oath means nothing to me. You made sure of that. You destroyed everything. I lost everything because of you.
Aaron.
Everything I lost isn't worth a damn.
If anything, Ange by the series' end is a message about empowerment, fighting to earn everything that's worth having in the world and claiming it with one's own hands. It just went far in showing the fall, so the rise back up from zero feels all the better to see her triumph in the end. And her antagonists either get what was coming to them, or grow the hell up and recognize how awful they were. Ange ascending out of hell back into heaven, and bringing everyone back with her with unbroken wings.
Honestly, the closest I'd relate Cross Ange to any other Sunrise series is actually Code Geass, as several larger elements between the two shows are pretty similar. The Vilkis has an amalgamation of abilities between the Gurren, the Shinkiro, and Lelouch's original Gawain, and Ange herself comes across as being, spiritually, the child of Lelouch v. Britannia and Colin Kazuki, with how their character elements meld perfectly into her, and ends on how some people view a true happy ending might have come for a series like that. Hell, Super Robot Wars X, the next game in the series, lampoons the hell out of how Ange is basically Lelouch and Colin's daughter. However, there is a problem with how Ange gains her own resolve to fight and how her story here in this game starts. And that, unfortunately, comes from the series that intrusively invades it, which had not been introduced yet.
Part of the issue of some of the Super Robot Wars games is sometimes too many series can be thrown into the amalgamated story, and resultantly crowd out others that are trying to take the spotlight and have their stories told. A number of shows from Yoshiki Tomino that are part of this have no reason being here and have no impact on the plot. But because they are, they strangle out the attention that can be paid to other series and franchises more deserving, and the possibility to better pace the story and character interactions. This is demonstrated when the cast of Double Zeta Gundam obtrusively invade the stage that is supposed to be centrally about Ange, and are actually gaining the resolve to fight on her own. Instead, Judao Ashita, Double Zeta's protagonist, intersects onto her story instead of anyone else we already knew, and takes it away from her by him and his Gundam giving her the sudden will to live instead of allowing her to decide that for herself. And that's not only insulting, but kind of sexist in a way Cross-Ange never presented itself as, but is actually common to Yoshiki Tomino's works overall. Between the two, it completely shoves out the attention that should be going to getting people on board these newer characters and use of them throughout the stages, which then is going to make people default to, oh hey cool, other stuff is here. When honestly, Sagara would have made more sense about talking Ange through her crisis. First, because he was introduced in the prior stage, so he was already an established character, and second, because all he's known is war, and to survive through the worst hells on Earth, unknowing of what a normal life is until he was assigned to guard Kaname, an event that changed his life for the better, as now he doesn't want to go back to being nothing but a soldier, which is advice Ange could use in coming to her decision, instead of being told to do something, as Judao does, and then following it instead of making it her choice. But because this got shoved in, we don't get that. Now to be clear, I'm not bashing Judao for doing this. Wanting someone to not give up on life is in character for the guy, especially with how Hamankar died for no reason by giving up hers in one of the UC Gundam's worst deaths. But the writer for this game choosing here to inject him in a support cast to do it, that is a hell of a lot more of a problem, when we already have enough cast members to go around, and we could have waited for them until later when we get to more Universal Century stuff where they would have slotted in far better.
And it's not just Ange hurt by this here. The same is true by proxy for the Full Metal Panic characters, which also got screwed out of story focus here thanks to the Double Zeta crew propping in with how they're basically irrelevant for a long stretch of the game after they're added to the cast. If they were going to be included here and have their stories take the focus in the game, then they deserve their own fair shake to sell the audience on them without an intrusive other series overriding the focus spotlight as Double Zeta's intro here does. It would have worked so much better by Sagara encouraging Ange to fight and survive to find a home and life again, and spit in the face of everyone that said they shouldn't, as he learned to with Kaname. As opposed to Judao telling her to live after coming in completely blind to everything going on. It was supposed to be Ange's choice, Ange's epiphany to rise up and seek to fly again, instead of it being forced upon her by worthless new type psychic powers. The series fusion should allow these series to support one another, not take advantage of them or make it so that they have to solve their problems so someone else can do something they were already able to in their own canons. Every other series introduction story in this game does this, except when it involves Tomino characters. And from what I've seen and been told about many of the other Super Robot Wars games, this is a recurring problem with the entries that use the UC Timeline stuff throughout them, where the UC Timeline members screw over other series casts like this for their own promotion and glorification, and people legitimately hate it. Seriously, we need more Super Robot Wars games where they put the UC Timeline stuff to rest so other series can legitimately see their proper spotlight.
Anyways, both the Mithril Gang and Double Zeta characters are here because of the aforementioned dimensional rifts that are intersecting with their own Earth. Apparently the dragons are native to their Earth in this game, and are crossing over because the founding nations did something to cause all this, with the Norma used as their attack dogs against the dragons. Not that anyone knows that at this point. And since they don't know how to get back on their own, the Tuatha De Danan's joining this ship alliance, with the AU team helping out as well, and they probably need it, as since everyone's an outsider to the founding nation's mess, Arsenal soldiers are being obstinate both to them and the treatment of Ange.
Sidebar for people playing this. You're going to want to keep Ange as a main party character whenever possible. The Vilcus is ridiculously powerful and fast, to the point they actually nerfed it and Ange in Super Robot Wars X because they were that damn good, but it is unfortunately a glass cannon in that it takes damage easily. So overleveling her, paying to upgrade the Vilcus' armor, and giving Ange herself some pilot skills that improve her evasion end up a necessity. Ange's support skills when you use them, however, ensure her evasion, and also cash bonuses, which are super helpful. Normally, throughout the game, you'll want to keep the main protagonist of each focus series in the party as much as you can, especially since they're the ones with the long attack list and highest stat boosts, but beyond them, that doesn't mean there isn't room for variation on what you use.
But yeah, Anj starts out being treated like garbage by her fellow pilots, them shredding her clothes and pulling other malicious pranks until she just snaps and starts to go full yandere on them, before deciding to break protocol and go out on patrol solo, as she doesn't want her wingmates to take the opportunity to shoot her down, as they oh so obviously have showcased they don't want her here. And the replacement captain of the unit, Salia, has not helped things either by coming down on Anj, but not her antagonists.
Granted, Salia has her own reasons for screwing Anj. Not like that. The Vilcus has a history, and Salia wanted to be its pilot. Jill, Arsenal's main commander, however, gave it to Anj for reasons later explained. The short version of the story? The Vilcus is very particular about its pilots, and Salia would not have been able to use it at all.
And Hilda, the redhead who was in a forced relationship with the team's previous captain but was getting something out of it in turn, has been subtle in her sabotage, as what the captain was getting her was something she desperately needed. Her deciding to screw up the Vilcus' maintenance so it ends up crashing on a random island.
Damn you. You bitch!
I am a tiny snowball with huge knockers, and my rage will still down!
Yeah, on reflection, Hilda kind of comes across as a Sadodere. She's a character that ends up growing on you, though obviously that results in a different discourse. Regardless, this is where we have the game's first route split, with us either staying with the Anj, 00, and Full Metal Panic casts, or following the Tedesco, AU, Crossbone, and Brave Express Corps back to Japan. As said, keeping my guide in the party helps you with game progression, but just as often the one focused more around the real robots has stronger story to it. When both routes meet up again, you then get everything anyways, so the way I will be doing this is will do the divergent route stories first, then swing back to the My Gun path most of the time. But this is again proof of why the Double Zeta cast wasn't needed here, as with the number of cast members in just this part, you could have sent Mithril with the Robots Corps to allow the Anj story to play out better, instead of leaving them as inactive party members. Especially with how this route then recruits more people as a better story tie-in.
But yeah, the sabotage performed by Hilda and her co-harassers Chris and Rosalie are quickly found out by the other series casts, sending them off on a search for Anj, which actually baffles most of the Arsenal personnel, who just chose to write her off as lost. It's a showcasing, I feel, of why the series struggled with many, as half the cast, despite their collective backstory, are just not sympathetic. They treated the lead as trash from day one, broke their own rules when they first deployed her, and then make her feel worse perpetually when she screwed up, yet are surprised when she wants to take out their ill treatment on them? Sorry, the well-adjusted people in the cast are not having this at all, and are holding them accountable for their ill treatment of someone who didn't know better in regards to their initial insult, and whom you've only treated worse by comparison.
Again, this is what happens when the world amalgamation in the story is working. You get a chance to call out the mistreatment characters are unfairly given from an objective perspective, and the characterization of all is then improved as they learn their lessons faster.
Regardless, Anj is made to an island when her paramail failed, and has been found, and stripped of her clothes, by this perv, Tusk. Anj's canonical love interest, well, one of them, and complete klutz who, despite appearances, actually does mean well.
Tusk is a tool, and one of the divisive elements of Crossange, as people have understandable reasons to dislike the guy with how he finds himself face-planting into Anj's crotch, where at the very least he would then receive righteous vengeance from Anj for it. I dislike this element of the story as well, and would have liked the character more had that been only a one-time accident if they needed to do it at all, but I felt like I got more into the give us a reason to see Tusk suffer karma side of the running gag that made him more tolerable and not be against the guy in principle like others understandably are. For me, this is primarily due to the influence of the dub, where Tusk is voiced by Austin Tyndall, who is best known for playing Nito Monoma, Valley Lucifer, and a certain scientific accelerator, who are all characters people enjoy the image of them getting punched in the face.
Your head is bleeding. Did the rubble hit you?
Nothing that dramatic. You lack aesthetic. You don't understand the values of a villain or what it means to be evil. This gun's aim must be off.
You won't really do it. I won't? Is that what you think? Let's see if you're right.
How crazy is it that a villainous bastard like me is the only one who's ever cared enough to stick up for her all this time? If damn heroes would do their job and show up when they're supposed to, stupid mistakes like this never would have been possible in the first place. That kid might be okay. If you had been there, she wouldn't have had to suffer like that! Good guys, bad guys, come on, grow up! Are you saying that in order to help someone struggling to hold on needs help, but doesn't have the strength to ask? It's no skin off your nose to try and help! If they're important, what's stopping you? No one else can tell you what to do! I chose the path of evil, and I excelled at living that life. However...
And because I connect the actor illusion, I get greater satisfaction from the retribution Tusk takes here than others might. Beyond that aspect though, Tusk is otherwise a harmless, helpful, and non-offensive character with his own reasons to fight. And thankfully, V extremely tones down that one caustic element of his portrayal. But in contrast, he ends up better proving his worth as a love interest in the series than the game showcases. Primarily due to his narrative task of being supportive towards Anj, which starts her on addressing her issues and opening up to others, which is a large, key piece to her character development that would not have happened without their interaction. Nor likewise would Tusk have gotten involved in everything had the two not met, as Anj inspired in him the will to fight again, which he'd lost after the big bad of their series murdered everyone he'd ever loved. Not so much in Super Robot Wars, where he's just there off to the side, and it's kind of a disservice to the guy, accidental perversions notwithstanding. A lot of series love interests admittedly end up having that feeling of just being there, but I gotta say, of the 3 Super Robot Wars games I've played now, Tusk I feel gets it the worst. Only really earning the title over Sala, who I will discuss later when she appears, or Hilda, who comes to be infatuated with Anj as the series progresses, because they start out on neutral terms with one another. Well, that, and they met each other on the Island of Isolated Lovers! A recurring Sunrise trope Gundam Seed started for Sunrise's productions, and was later seen in this series, as well as Code Geass, Gundam 00, and others as well. If a pair of characters end up on the Island of Isolated Lovers, then the expectation is they are the intended romance for the show, even if one of the pair ends up dying within the story. And fans are not happy if that is contradicted.
Tusk has experience with paramales, though, as his mother was actually a paramale rider, so fixes up the Vilkiss over a week, and honestly Anj is tempted to stay with him, as beyond Tusk accidentally perving on her, he's the first person to treat her well since her life fell apart. But before one or the other can actually seduce their opposite partner, Othrin Zala shows up!
Okay, Othrin, you have a mini harem of love interests in your own show. There is no need to take them from others just because your original betrothed never loved you and found herself into your best friend.
Yes, this is where the Gundam Seed Destiny integration starts. In this world, this island is actually the same one that started Sunrise's Island of Isolated Lovers trope. When 2 years before this, during the original Seed, Othrin and his first love interest, Kigali Eula Atha, shot each other down and washed up here. Tusk in this timeline helping them out during that incident. Kigali's nation, Orb, is more or less in secret alliance with both Arsenal and Celestial Being, and helps them out from time to time. So Sumeragi contacted their government, once more run by Kigali since this is post-Seed Destiny, which deployed him to help search for Anj. However, before Othrin can take her back, a flock of dragons appears, which in turn gives Anj more than a feral will to live, but something more important than that. Someone she wants to protect. And hey, without the rest of Arsenal, she does have people she can call her legitimate allies now. Of course, since these are both Sunrise series, the two combatants can't help but compare their units to their friends. Anj fighting a lot like Kira does, at least until we have new interlopers come into this that aren't the dragons. More of those extra-dimensional units we encountered before have made their way here, requiring the intervention of the rest of the cast we have, to the continued dysfunction of the Arsenal soldiers, as the youngest and oldest members of the team, the cute Vivian and the mature Ursha, have come to have a more supportive air to their interactions with her after she did try to make amends for her original screw-up. And Anj actually listening to them in turn as she recognizes that. But before this, didn't feel she deserved their kindness. Interactions with Tusk changing that. Again, my point in all this. Anj screwed up when she was at the most vulnerable point in her life, but she's not the one who was instigating it and kept it going. Still, drone units aren't much of a challenge in comparison to those who have to take on literal dragons, allowing the fight to wrap quickly, and for Anj to say her farewells to Tusk, who lets on to there being more to the conflict with the dragons. The ones they just fought, they were intercepted on a direct path that would have led to where the founding nations are desecrating the corpses of the dragons fled before, using their remains for their own purposes. Back at base, Anj gives everyone around her a second shot at being friends, leading to Othrin's introduction as Orb's Red Flash, someone celestial being respects in ending wars, and how women are just infatuated with him. This being a meta-reference for how even real women fancied the guy, which has caused him no end of troubles. Rosalie and Chris, the newest ones to fawn over him, though not liking it when Anj gets the same attention back from others.
Because the two are hypocrites, and the game freely calls them out on it until they knock it off. Ironically, the two get together later after the college to their attitudes make them a bit more introspective at how they treat others, even themselves. Again, Cross Anj has legitimate problems, but even the show acknowledges them internally and does address them in such a way that shows these issues were built and intended to be part of its larger story arc, instead of either being ignored or fixed hastily stapled on as an afterthought, if at all, as it is with actual bad writing with such matters.
But part of the problem keeping this animosity going is the payment system Arsenal has for their male writers. While the island has resources and luxuries made available to them, it makes them fight competitively to afford them. They only get paid and their living expenses cared for by them actually killing dragons and taking down targets, on an individual basis. Part of the continued animosity with Anj is, in her desire to not be betrayed again nor allow anyone to die because of her, she's not been giving the other members of her squad chances at combat actions. She's been slaughtering them solo, and it's been costing everyone else their pay. The way it's set now, they're not a team working to protect a vulnerable country, they're rivals competing with each other for kills after they were thrown to the wolves. Like, Mithril are mercs, but even they get paid a base salary. Focus on this is distracted by the appearance of Anj's former maid, Momoka, who came to the island in hopes that, well, she could serve Anj again. Say what you will of the other betrayals in her life, Momoka was legitimately her friend. She knew from the start what Anj was, and she didn't care. Anj is Anj to her, but Anj is hesitant to accept that. And worse, for founding nation citizens, coming to Arsenal is a death sentence, as the nation's governments keep secret the war with the dragons as part of their propaganda that Norma are isolated on Arsenal for their own good. A lie and system Othrin calls out as ridiculous and unjust. Regardless, Momoka manages to break through to Anj about her actually caring about her, thus giving her another reason to fight and succeed, to renewed conflict with the other women, until Sumeragi just puts her foot down as their infighting risks getting them all killed when a founding nation's patrol finds them infiltrating their airspace. Jill has put the first Paramail squad under Sumeragi's purview, and she's changing their payment system to one with base pay and bonuses. Bonuses scaled by how well they work together. Outright telling them to swallow their damn pride and egos already before you do things you can't take back. Which is in turn exemplified by our next character introductions.
Luna Maria Hawk, Core Splendor, 行くわよ!
Shin Asuka, Destiny, 行きます!
Yes, Shin Asuka and his girlfriend Luna Maria, two who screwed up big time just because they ignored the crises of others for their own wants, and in some's view, went over the moral event horizon.
And here's where I actually need to talk about Seed Destiny again, as, well, the show is a train wreck. There are sharp divides on the merits of the series, but no one has an entirely positive or negative view on it, matching exactly the scriptwriter discourse and inconsistencies. But in general, the split is centered on whether the first half, which focused on Shin but heavily screwed over the previously existing characters, is better, or the latter half that shifts the focus back to Kira and Othrin after Shin is morally compromised, falls from grace, and becomes a full-on bad guy that closes out the show while gelling more with the prior show's thematic direction, is superior. I end up being one of the few that straddles the line between the two, as, well, I saw what the show was supposed to be doing throughout its entirety, and it's something I saw because of other series at the same time doing it, and it being old hat for Japanese series to do it. Shin Asuka was the series' protagonist, but he was not the series' intended hero. He is in fact a protagonist villain, with his story arc being one grand fall from grace, similar to Anakin Skywalker from the Star Wars prequels since, well, the Seed series draws some comparisons to and inspiration from Star Trek and Star Wars in their story structure, arc, and recurring tropes, because Chiaki Morisawa was apparently a huge dork for Western sci-fi shows. And the entire discourse over Destiny does have some parallels to the debates over Star Wars prequel and sequel trilogies as well, primarily in how people do not like the characters they got attached to being screwed over to promote new people or interpretations the audience have not been endeared to or conflict with their views of the old, and how careless mishandling of such can ruin a newer character's reputation as they can become the reason why an existing character ended up being treated horribly. I certainly know people that despise The Last Jedi because of how they depicted Luke Skywalker being against what they believe the character is like, and that turned them off the entire sequel trilogy. And that's basically the same thing that happened for many people in regards to Seed Destiny and Shin Asuka's arc. If they liked Shin, then they ignored the bad things Shin did and how Shin was acting out, thus viewed Othrin's attempted mentorship as intrusive, and Kira Yamato's armed interventions against him as excuses to hate on them, instead of an attempt to de-escalate tension and try to refocus it all on those actually responsible for the war. If they thought Shin was a jerk before, and viewed his backstory as not excusing his conduct, it became a new reason to hate him, as a depiction of other characters was being screwed over to promote him as a better person when he didn't come off as one, thus harming the sympathy that should have surrounded him and made the decisions he took explicable. Which, when the show then got to Shin's fall to being a legit bad guy, well, that's where the series broke for them, as the mishandling of perspectives Destiny suffered didn't allow the full arc to connect the way it was supposed to.
Now, of course, there are other, more active and malicious antagonists in the series that permit and perpetuate its story, so it doesn't really seem like it to many to make Shin the villain. But that is in fact Shin Asuka's role. Unlike the others, though, you are supposed to sympathize with him up to a point. In the original Gundam Seed, his home country of Orb was invaded by the Earth Alliance government in order to take over their mass driver to send their forces into space after their own had been destroyed, an action that would have allowed them to commit genocide to those living in space. Orb, a country that had not allied with either the Earth Alliance or the government of the planet's colonies, fought back to protect their people, but because they're a small country fighting the world, it was a losing battle. Shin, then a civilian, lost his parents and sister in the battle, surviving only by chance as one of the Earth Alliance's Gundams incinerated them, with his life saved by one of Orb's officers that got him out of harm's way. While the pilot that killed them was eventually killed in the final battle of the war, that didn't do anything to comfort Shin. He joined Zaft, the military of the plants, and became one of their ace pilots, and when war broke out again, he was on the front lines, and was finally free to slaughter both the Earth forces, and also that of Orb, who the Earth Alliance had enslaved into service, including the man who had saved him, who Shin then mercilessly slaughtered. As in those interim years, Shin came to blame Orb, blame his former country for their neutrality, for their refusal to take sides in a conflict that was so clear to him, even as both sides planned genocide as the final solution to the aggression of the other. In the early side of Destiny, Shin was used as Zaft's attack dog and weapon, a reaping monster of vengeance with only the attempted mentorship of Othran, who had gone through what Shin had in losing his own mom and making similar mistakes, holding him back, as did falling in love with enemy pilot and fellow victim to the Earth Alliance's cruelty, Stella Lucier.
Stella Lucier, on top of helping Shin's arc to click for me, is one of several reasons I cannot bring myself to outright hate the Cosmic Era Gundam series. Not like they are that deserving of the constant bashing they get in the first place. Because she is a character and story done better here than was previously done several times before in Universal Century content. Most notably, in the role of 4 Murasame from Zeta Gundam.
4 herself mostly fit the same role as Stella. They are both individuals experimented upon by the Earth government in order to bring out their potential in piloting special mobile units. 4 to unleash psychic powers, while Stella trained to be a savage killing machine specializing in killing coordinators. Both of them are slaves to these identities and fight their respective paramour on multiple occasions, but the difference is in how each series treats them. In Zeta Gundam, 4's characterization begins and ends as an accessory to Zeta Gundam's protagonist Camille Bidan. She has no other role in the story and doesn't exist in her own right other than to be a victim of the Earth Federation's authoritarian cruelty and a tragic loss for Camille, and another in a list of lost loved ones victim to the callous antics of Camille's incompetent rival Jared, one that was unneeded after all the others he commits. Cut 4 from the story, and absolutely nothing tangibly changes about anything at all within it, as after her death, she doesn't matter. She has no impact on the story told. Hell, the story itself shows that she never mattered and only existed to be a story device, as then the story with 4 repeats itself by creating another character like 4, Rosami Badan, and then doing the entire thing all over again to same lacking effect. Same background, same arc with minor differences, same Gundam type, the Psycho Series Gundams, and same ultimate fate of death with there being no tangible impact to the story and could be skipped over in a compilation movie without changes to the narrative that makes their inclusion questionable at best.
This, on top of a refusal to recognize the Earth Federation is maliciously evil, is part of a general problem I have with Tomino series and the Universal Century, particularly any woman Tomino and his staff write. Even if you may be fond of them or like them, they are frequently written and treated as disposable story devices and not as characters. They're to meet a gruesome end to make an anti-war statement, but they were only made to make that statement, and rarely exist as people in their own right. And it's a problem many other Sunrise series have suffered because of his influence. It's like a slasher movie, where you need disposable cannon fodder to show the slasher villain is powerful or skilled, but you don't care to actually give them any character beyond being a jackass or a damsel in the situation. And in turn, Tomino's adaptation of it is characters made under him are written as something for someone else, not as a stand-in for an actual person who could actually live and exist in the real world on their own. Other Gundam series have actual characters and relationships, are allowed to evolve and be their own people even in the confines of the scripted fictional setting, and are thus less disposable and have weight to their actions and their potential death. The example I used before, with Neil Delaney's death in 00 Season 1, that was a tangible, fleshed-out, three-dimensional character. One who had their own life and story beyond the scope of what we saw, which had a tragic but inevitable end made from the choices of their own lives, even if it exists in a scripted story. Tomino works, you don't get that. At least not as often, and especially not if they are women. And even when you might see signs of it, it's a version that felt like you had to have your wisdom teeth removed to get. Awareness of that dampens the tragedy that can be taken away from such incidents, as they become less and less stand-ins for the cost of war, but instead someone made to die. Characters like 4 then have less worth as people in stories made this way, unlike others who are given the time and attention to potentially be more.
And that is something you do see with Stella. What starts out as the girl in a trio of recurring berserkers piloting stolen Gundam units turns into a sympathetic character thanks to her and Shin ending up on the Island of Isolated Lovers, learning that she is another victim of the Earth Alliance's cruelty, and one that offers Shin himself a chance at his own redemption. Someone to save from themselves, to show that he can be better than those he fights against without becoming a monster to do so.
But he can't save her. What was done to her has damaged her too much, even with the love of someone, to be able to move beyond it. So traumatized her that even the slightest sign of threat or danger can send her rampaging again, just as her tormentors designed her to be. It is impossible for her to know peace, as all she remembers is suffering and war. Thus, her death, it is the tragedy of someone being unable to escape the trauma of the sins done and forced upon her because of their desire to wage war, instead of just another callous killing on top of a pile of other callous killings. It is an actual, natural end of a character's story, brought from them being incapable of changing their own fate, and self-destructing as a result, requiring she need to be put down before she takes those she loves with her.
怖いものはみんなステラなら私たちを
やめるんだステラやめろもう
As these days, I don't get that from Zeta Gundam. I don't get that from Tomino Tragedies anymore. Once you start killing everyone as practice, it's hard to want to get invested or go back and find investment in such a character with the expectation that they will die. You get jaded against feeling that investment as you think characters created in the manner like 4 and their deaths not matter or have meaning. And in the long term, for the greater anti-war message a lot of Gundam has as its entire theme, it undermines it. It undermines it more than the merchandising for the franchise. Again, it's part of why I have a greater appreciation for the non-UC Gundam timelines. They mostly avoid this issue.
And this in turn is where Shin is unable to turn back from the path he's been on all series, which is thus where the protagonist title in the series changes hands back to Kira and Atherin as the true heroes of its story, as they have to stop Shin's rampage and murder spree as she lashes out at everyone and everything. Stella's death being legitimately the last straw for him, even though he does not show his madness outwardly in most occasions. One only encouraged by the current leader of the coordinators that believes it's necessary to genetically rewrite what the definition of human is to avoid these tragedies, which Shin is then on board with as its punishment for those that broke the world. And this is why it is Atherin, and not Kira in the end, that puts him out of commission, as Atherin was the one that failed to turn him away from all that. So it has to be him that prevents that same tragedy they both lived through from occurring again when Shin then endangers Lunamaria's life, because Shin refuses to listen. He can't let go of his anger and hate against those who's caused him to lose everything, while he still has the power to affect the world with his Destiny Gundam. And this is the true reason to why he acts as the villain of Seed Destiny. Seed ended the First War by ending the conflict caused by racism, but it did nothing to settle the sorrow caused during it or those who sought to manipulate to their own ends the hate born from the sins of war and racism. Shin is thus a representative of those who want the war to continue, so they can take revenge on those who hurt them. That only results in the cycle of war starting again, because they can't get over what they've lost and don't know who to blame, and are coerced to make the wrong choices and blame the wrong people because of that pain. Shin Asuka, throughout Seed Destiny, is a character stuck in the first two stages in the cycle of grief, and it is not until Atherin tears the Destiny Gundam apart does he realize what he's done, what he almost did, and in Lunamaria's arms, finally allows himself to mourn.
That, ladies and gentlemen, is the actual character arc Shin Asuka goes through in Seed Destiny, that everyone else is playing parts in, as haphazardly as they do. Likewise, this is where we pick up on with Shin and Lunamaria here, attached to Orb's forces for the interim as they work to find themselves again after the war, and why, in this story, this is the perfect point to introduce them as an object lesson to the male writers. Shin's own actions mirrored the animosity between them, unable to let go of slights against them even when the believed to be offending party has tried to make amends, and they otherwise refuse to blame those actually responsible as they don't know who they are. This is a really smart way to include them for those who actually know the intentions of their stories, which many do not realize or intentionally misrepresent. As I have been implying throughout this, Western Gundam fans go absolutely insane for bashing Seed and Seed Destiny for the most ridiculous and frivolous of reasons. Far, far beyond what they're actually guilty of. And while there are legitimate reasons to gripe about these shows, most of the claims that are essentially focused on as the core of the complaints and the hate for them don't actually exist in the story if one bothered to pay attention, but are done to create an echo chamber that retroactively makes it seem as if Destiny screw-ups were true for the entirety of the timeline, and not a result of bad writing on the part of individuals that were not the original main writer or intended reflections of the storyline. The baseless rumor revolving around Shindo, Fukada, and Morisawa is just one example part of a larger track record of people making up excuses and misinterpreting what was actually shown to hate the Seed series, as opposed to providing valid criticisms. Of which, yes, there are many more reasonable ones they could use, and ignore the good things Seed did both on its own and served as inspiration for following series. An example, the creation of the power management element of their stories, the inclusion of actual real-world tactics, hell, putting real-world elements back into the real robot subgenre in and of itself, as in the 90s the lines between them and straight super robots had started to blur. And they did it by using a lot of real-world science or current experimental technology like the phase shift armor. Yeah, that is a real experimental technology. And even the presentation of characters and their personas took a step up here, as it made them less caricatures dissociated from how real people dropped in such can respond. And with time, the Seed series haven't grown more dated like many other Gundam series have, but have actually become more relevant, as their political commentary has more and more come to reflect the crises of our current reality. Gundam Seed talked about how war, privilege, and the desire for revenge make monsters of men. How easy it is to justify your actions and the killing of your fellow man in the heat of the moment, or because they think differently than you. How hard it can be to stop the fighting when everyone truly wants better but can't bring themselves to end it because of past sins and the view that the other side will oppress them and their values if they lose. Even if that concern is proven justified by senseless slaughters and outright massacres of the defenseless. A lot of Gundam series made claims to the same, but few actually reflect this, and even less did at the time the Seed series were made. A lot of good narrative things were inspired by the Seed series that would be utilized after as an enduring legacy as a new, fresh starting point. One that was a complete break from the influences of UC Gundam or prior Super Robot works. But a lot of people refuse to recognize that, and claim there's no merit at all to anything they did. Even though many series after it utilized elements that were popularized primarily by Seed and Seed Destiny. Another example that always stuck out for me, in between 2008 and 2010, I forget the exact date of when I saw it, I saw a guy make a multiple hour long presentation ranting about how the Destiny Gundam is terribly designed because of its wings of light propulsion system, which accelerates the unit more the longer it is in flight, and for it being underarmed. Forgetting, of course, that Gundams from the other timelines are often even worse supplied than it, and the Destiny's armament variety, as it was, is on par with the Perfect Strike Gundam that this same person also claimed to be overloaded, weighted down garbage. So, that complaint is asinine. And the actual reason it was designed that way was for it to be a high-speed interception unit to shoot down enemy units and battleships that are firing nuclear weapons to murder civilian populaces. And thus the Wings of Light allow it to charge through the defenses of heavy assault units like the mass-produced Destroy Gundams that can erase cities if left on their own, so in context the Destiny as it was built upstages them with far less needed equipment. And that propulsion system that was the main point of ridicule creates afterimages that prevent long-range assaults from locking onto it while at a distance, which is a requirement for it to properly perform its attack interception. Context made the bashing done really stupid, as they didn't even acknowledge any of that. Like, did that even take me 2 minutes to defang an argument a guy ranted and raved about for hours? And that's not even getting into the outright conspiracy theory that blames Lacus Clyne for everything that happens in all the Seed series as the secret villain of them, when she has nothing, like, absolutely nothing to do with why the two major factions on each side are fighting. And it's part of the group trying to de-escalate or resolve tensions so people can work out their issues without having to escalate to genocide like the extreme radicals in each camp want, who refuse to listen to reason or are otherwise manipulating people into wanting to kill each other, which she and her allies are trying to end. Like, how is that villainous? Is it because she's a main character or major character in the series that's not a villain, like you expect from Yusei Gundam? I seriously do not grasp the logic here.
The same can be said for the hate around the character of Kira Yamato. Yes, he's showing up soon. In that any slight, no matter what, is used to bash the guy without real cause. Like, I'll rag on characters I dislike endlessly, but it's always for bad things they actually did, which the story doesn't recognize, or how the story bent over backward to excuse their actions when there was no justification for misconduct, and every little thing in turn providing further context to why that is. But when it comes to Kira, well, even if the character does something that both makes sense in the setting, or was done before by a prior Gundam protagonist without any issue in similar circumstances, they hate on him for it. And it practically did start from the character's first appearance, as he writes in minutes a new operating system for the Strike Gundam in his first sortie in his first episodes. That is used as the first excuse to hate him, but did anyone actually pay attention to why he could actually do that?
The reason he could was because writing those types of programs was what he was actually going to school for as a tech engineer, as was set up earlier in the goddamn episode. Not only that, we saw in a preceding scene other coordinators like Kira doing the same, only they did just well enough at it to get their machines moving instead of fully operational, because that was not their trained, educated skill set. And that skill set makes the most sense for piloting an experimental unit with a half-finished operating system, and applying additional fixes and improvements to said OS over the course of the first full half of the series, as he was already piece by piece doing in class. That allows him to survive against inferior units in unplanned environments that outwit him, which he has to survive through, or ones with that jury-wigged, patched-in OSs on the other G units that leave them less responsive, as they don't have a tech engineer that can make a new one or fix the broken one on their support crews, with that advantage lasting until he gets the skill at piloting that would allow him to match or exceed those he's fighting. And even then, he spends a long time as the underdog in fights that only escapes by the skin of his teeth or by others playing an equal part in the battle, which leads to his rapid skill development that allows him to later stand on his own, and then his survival from the first war gives him grade A status over the much more fresh-to-combat Shin that explains their severe skill disparity in Destiny. Even when the seed factor of the series gets involved, this doesn't change much, as that ability acts no different from Clear Mind, Ultra Instinct, Domon Kashu's Flow State Hyper Mode, or a few dozen other Berserker or Limit Break abilities seen in both real life and fiction without issue, and that is explained and explored as well.
And that is how much of the first arc of Seed plays out for its character balancing act. A fully operational unit with an inexperienced pilot facing off against half-operational units piloted by those with some training. So it's not a matter of Super Coordinator Magic Gary Stu protagonist powers as is often claimed, it's you literally missed or ignored the exposition about the traits of the cast that justify the following story. Hell, even the later, why is a pacifist being a hypocrite by fighting in a war stuff makes sense. First by him being manipulated by someone using his affections for them against him to make him want to fight to protect them and kill in their name until he can't do it anymore, which likewise shows he's not the perfect man Jesus allegory he's also commonly accused of, as since he does have character flaws this series recognizes, and then later Kira finding a reason to fight and a tool that won't require him to kill. And most of the bashing of the character I always see done about matters along these lines I've been describing. People missing the legitimate context that occurs in the story that justified the events in it. It's really the only case in Gundam where this freaking happens.
Because Gary Stu's and Mary Su's, when the archetype isn't being used for parody, are generally characterized by 5 things: exotic or highly attractive appearance, implausible backstory, inability to recognize their own flaws or the story not holding them as flaws, narrative breaking or contradicting powers, and the story bending over backwards to excuse their conduct when in real life doing the same would be unjustifiable. You don't need to hit every bullet point, but Kira doesn't even really meet half the requirements for that to warrant the slander. At best, he has violet eyes, but he's not alone in that, and his abilities and origin make sense in universe. He is recognized as having flaws, and when he screws up, he is held accountable for it. More than some other Gundam protagonists are. And even his armed intervention stuff in Seed Destiny is explicable. But it took forever for Destiny to give the context that he was pulling the same stuff that the Gundam Meisters in Gundam 00 later did, and ending needless, wasteful conflicts to save lives. And this has not helped that the specific episode writers for those events were writing him out of character to make him seem as an antagonist blocking Shin's path. Again, I'm not trying to make an argument for people to start liking the guy or these series if they have legitimate issues with them, and I get how the character was utilized in Destiny as an obstacle for Shin, as part of Shin's own pre-scripted Skywalker Fall from Grace story was so poorly executed that he joins the many Seed originating characters that Destiny screwed over due to how bad the series was overall with character depiction and direction due to the writers brought in being legitimately that terrible with consistent developmental characterization. Again, the same writer pulled the same shit in Code Geass R2 to an even worse degree. But the bashing Kira specifically gets just because he intervened to save the lives of enslaved people and was an obstacle for Shin in Destiny when in universe Shin was in the wrong is ridiculously unfair, as are many of people's excuses to hate on these shows that aren't present within them. And just so I'm clear, if you don't like them for things they actually did wrong, then that's completely fine. That's not my issue with this, and why I generally avoid the Gundam fandom, as there are legitimate issues with the Seed series. The animation being below expectations because it was among the first digitally animated series Sunrise did. Other companies were doing worse at the time, or otherwise had their budget taken and redistributed to other Sunrise projects of the time, such as Gundam Evolve and the utterly god-awful MS Igloo OVAs, which only isn't the worst Gundam series because they're OVAs. And relatedly, the reuse of stock footage that resulted from that. A lot of people don't like the soap opera drama nature of the story, or how it tries to depict actual emotion in war, or the self-loathing of being forced to kill without a jaded dissociation from it, which some prior protagonists are misinterpreted as having even if they factually didn't, and were suffering trauma as opposed to expressing them externally, like Seed does with most of the cast. Nor like the political plot that has a significant stake in the direction of events, and how it actively debates the merits and purposes of such conflict that can so easily spiral out of control, or even the prior characters we like getting thrown under a bus in Seed Destiny as part of the writing issues, even as they could be seen as an object lesson about how wars start again because of the apathy of the generation who lived through it, not acting to prevent further conflicts, which was a subtextual criticism of the UC series intended with the show that the replacement writers handled horribly. Hell, I'll even cop to feeling the original Seed does dwell a bit too much on Kira, despite it being centrally his story. But not to the point of completely erasing the existence and relevance of others in the ensemble that still do see spotlight, as there are some great main and supporting characters in the series, like Mula Flaga, Maru Ramius, and Andrew Waltfeld, that are badasses in their own right and get their chances to have an arc and shine, as other Gundam series have treated their supporting casts worse, or to having no purpose to them existing. And it's not like this is a case where one character hijacks and parasitically takes over other people's focused arcs in order to enslave those affected to them and their own selfish glorification. But when I've seen people discuss Seed, it's rare that any of that or other legitimate critiques are brought up, nor is mentioned what the story legitimately does right to zig where other Gundam series and the failings of the Universal Century timeline as a whole zagged to make itself a distinct story about war born from racism and a belief that a people are, by birth, superior to others, and the work to counter the idea that the only way to win a war is to kill all that oppose you, instead of stopping the sources at the root of the fighting by getting rid of the central insiders of the conflict and those who spread their propaganda and malice then indoctrinate their followers into believing in lies that damage the world around them. As if you get rid of those who damage the world and irrefutably prove how wrong they were, you should be able to talk down the rest and rehabilitate them unless they've gone full racial supremacist that lacks even a semblance of empathy and consideration of others in their bodies. Now, the most frequent criticisms I always hear are people latching on to ancillary shit as if such were some big sin and blowing them out of proportion, or just straight bashing or misrepresentative remarks that aren't true in context of the series, which shows how little they actually paid attention. Or are complaints made against it that the Universal Century series are just as, or even more guilty of committing. And yet, the people making those complaints have no interest in holding the UC series accountable for them, or alternatively, praise the UC versions of these events for those originating sins they blame the other series for. Again, I don't hate the UC timeline series. If any series I like does something bad, I'm more than willing to cop to it. But the exclusive praise held for them amidst the endless bashing of the AU timelines is ridiculous when those doing so refuse to hold the UC series accountable for their own problems or being the origin of ones nearly all of Gundam shares. Like, try watching all of the Gundam series in release order sometime. You'll actually see how refreshing the AU series end up being, as opposed to the order in which Western audiences got them in, which I feel is part of the problem. Likewise, if you feel like I'm being over-defensive on this one, well, you're not entirely wrong, but I've had to put up with this imbecilic, absent of any intelligent critique bashing of the Sage series for nearly 20 goddamn years, when no one does that for any of the other Gundam series. And it was actually just nice to finally have a means by which to vent about it that actually backs up my central argument as this game does.
But anyways, yeah, Shin's in the recovery stage of his jackassery, trying to move on from the person that he once was, and he's going to start that out by defending the Earth from those who would callously threaten human lives, with Luna right there by his side. Still, with Sumeragi setting the last major stumbling block to the Arsenal First Squad's internal bickering, Anj makes a choice. She's going to buy Momoka's service, and thus, as her acting as property from the perspective of her superiors, Momoka can stay without being killed, allowing Anj a confidence she can trust even if her relationships with everyone else fall through. Something Shin at least sees happening, as to him, Othran just called him here to deal with a bunch of terrible women. Between scenarios, however, Nine gets a chance to interview Sosuke Sagara's arm slave, AI, trying to figure out the contrast between herself, and the Brave Express Corps robots, before asking Shin about his love life with Luna, which in turn gets the girls of Arsenal pondering about the strange relationships skewed between Shin and Luna, Sosuke and Kaname, and the love triangles around some of the others, including Anj's isolation off with Momoka.
Well, you see, it has to do with the long process of courting a tsundere.
Still, Salia's own agenda has her attempt to get Anj off the Vilcus, still wanting it for herself, but with Sumeragi taking over control of her units, any chance of convincing Jill of that is gone. Especially since Anj has gone to Celestial Being for support and reported to them what she learned of the Dragon Harvest, and details Jill omitted from her briefings, while the rest of their squad is endeared to the Tactical Forecaster for allowing them to have a salary for financing their respective interests, even though they still resist integration of those they feel are outsiders. Chris and Rosalie this time going after Shin and how, you know, he was previously a genocidal lunatic until Othran beat his ass. It's actually Sosuke that comes to his defense, since Sosuke is not from here, telling Shin that, hey, if you majorly screwed up, own it, apologize, and do better. And to his credit, Shin is working to do better now that his eyes were forcibly opened. But since stuff is on sale in the shop, well, Anj and Salia have a fateful encounter.
Glittering with the light of romance, winning battles with the power of love. I'm Holy Knight Pretty Salia! You can't escape the strength of a girl's heart!
Yeah, Salia cosplays and fantasizes about wanting to be a magical girl, and Anj just walked in on her.
6 out of 10. Might want to try making a contract with Leviathan to get lessons.
Salia is of course humiliated for being found out, now plotting to actively murder Anj before she can spill, but Honestly, I think this is a perfectly understandable fantasy to have. The Norma have been denied the ability to use the Magitech that is mana, so wanting to be a magical girl, that should be normal for a Norma, as that's what normal girls in their society get to be on a regular day. Is it really that taboo in Arsenal to have that fantasy? And likewise, beyond piloting Vilcus, what is Salia's deal with Ange, for her to be this antagonistic to her? She tries to call Ange out on her conduct among them, but she has a legitimate reason to be hostile to everyone, considering her teammates are sabotaging everything she does and trying to get her killed, and Salia has done nothing but let them do it. Salia complains that she's a bad leader because of Ange, but the reality is Salia is a bad leader because she's done just as much to enable the harassment, which has spurred Ange's own actions to defy them and survive in spite of them. There are many reasons for the team's broken dynamics, and Salia has allowed every one of their causes to come about. And Ange shows she's once again a better person than the rest of them, as even after this, she's not going to out Salia's secret passion, because it's not her business nor place to judge. Not like she has a chance to, though. The cold weather of Arsenal, and Ange's lack of clothing, has resulted in her getting sick, unable to pilot just as dragons attack again. The male writers think it's their chance to shine, show they don't need Ange, and it blows up in their faces as a large swarm of dragons appear around them, because of all the people there who have lived through that in fighting to see it for what it really is from them. Bickering children that have to be led by their noses to the truth that them ostracizing a team member when they're already down fighters is going to lead to more of them dying, as they all struggle without Ange's fervor leading the charge to soften up the rest of the enemy forces. Not just with a death wish, but to do the work of 3 people. The 3 that were lost because of her. This is of course lost on the male riders, until a new set of dragons, ones never seen before, enter the battle, and cast a gravity field on the environment, which causes most of the units to drop to the floor, taking everyone out of the battle or ability to counter, at least until 2 blue and white units swoop in from the sky. One of them Ange, coming in despite her illness because it's her duty to fight, so she doesn't have to see anyone die again. Salia finally coming into her own as a leader, and getting the sick Ange to listen to her. Ange following Salia's instructions to disable the gravity field by using it against the dragons, and in doing so getting the Paramel unit over most of their issues by the trust it took to pull this maneuver off. As for the other...
Well, since I first announced that I was doing this, I've been asked what Gundam is my favorite, and it should kind of be obvious because I've been trolling my audience with it on my set for years now. My favorite Gundam's hunting dragons. God damn, I love this game. Also, for those about to complain about Kira and the freedom killing stuff, well, 1, Kira in these games always has the special skill Mercy that has the option to leave a unit with 10 HP after an attack. And 2, technically they're scored as shot down, not killed. You can shoot an event unit down and the pilot can survive to appear later, so one does not by default mean the other. The same with Kira's usual means of bringing peace through superior firepower, and that the way Kira fights causes such an extreme demoralization through dominating the battlefield without necessarily meaning to kill that is just as effective in ending conflicts as it would slaughtering them wholesale. Hell, it has better chances of working as it lets the enemy know that if they leave, they'll live, and that is good encouragement for them to leave, as opposed to the slaughter, where they just want to fight more in the hopes that stopping him will allow them to survive. And 3rd, well, Kira's killed lots of people. It's just after his skill level got high enough, he legitimately has the option of not needing to if he doesn't have to. He's one of the few Gundam protagonists that actually recognizes and utilizes that luxury, or exist in a setting where such is not only possible, but is reasonable to do so. Primarily because a lot of Gundam protagonists forget they have that option, or are prevented from taking it.
But there's also a bonus from deploying the Seed Mecha in combat, ones most of the others do not have. Kira, Athrin, and later Lacus, as well as Shin and Luna Maria, have access to combo attacks. Line the Strike Freedom and Infinite Justice, or the Destiny and Force Impulse Gundams together, within one square of each other, and they unlock special attacks that are stronger than any of the other skills. And they are just the best things when you can line up your own units like that for checkmate.
This admittedly is a thing for some other units introduced later. Daiton and Zambot both have one together that doesn't make much sense as their series only crossed over in these games, but are apparently in a trilogy with another show. But the only other one I really care for comes much later.
Oh, and yes, Kira's taking some time off from his newest job being Lacus's head of military in the plants, so expect to see the Strike Freedom as a regular on the battlefield from me. And with most of the interpersonal crap out in the open, Salia finally starts being a real leader, tells her team to lay off Ange, and for Ange to stop hogging all of their rewards. It settles most of this, with the only holdout being Hilda because of what advantages she lost, who is at the very least still willing to be civil, but not close with Ange. A story ultimately mirrored between Shin and Kira, as even though Shin's with Luna now, the specter of him being unable to save Stella still haunts him, and likely will for the rest of his life. As much as he can't forgive Kira for killing her to save him, yet, he recognizes now that it was as much his fault, and can't forgive himself for it either, for not being able to save her in the first place.
Next time we'll flip to the Super Robot side again, as my guy gets a little blacker. Not like that!
The Martian successor schemes trap our heroes in distraction after distraction, the agents of Exev chaining their attention away from the rescue of Eureka Tenkuchi. The Titans of the Sun and Moon rise again as more old names are brought out of retirements, all as a void-stained train pulls up to the station. And wait, a Black Vilcus? Next time on Super Robot Wars V, Shadows of Sin, Successors of War.